24. I fainted in church. 3 Sundays in a row. The bishop said I was seeking attention. The first time I fainted, my mother straightened my cap before anyone else reached me. Not my hands, not my face, my cap. She pressed the white linen back into place along my hairline while I was still on the floor of the meeting house, still blinking at the ceiling beams, still trying to understand why the room had gone sideways. And then she looked up at the people gathering around us and said, quietly, "She's fine. She startles easily." I was 19 years old. I had not eaten since the evening before. I had been standing for nearly 2 hours in a room with no windows open, wearing 3 layers of clothing in the middle of August, and I had told her that morning, before we climbed into the wagon, that I felt strange. She had handed me a glass of water and told me to pray through it. I want you to understand something before I go any further. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one, and in the community where I grew up, those two things could look almost identical from the outside. My name is Sarah. I am 53 years old now, and I live a quiet life, and I have not stood inside a meeting house in more than 30 years. But I have thought about those 3 Sundays longer than I have thought about almost anything else in my life. Not because the fainting was the worst thing that happened to me. It wasn't. But because of what each person chose to do in the moments after I fell, and what those choices finally told me about how much I was worth to the people I had trusted most. That is the story I want to tell you today. I grew up the third of 6 children in a close district in central Pennsylvania. Our bishop, a man named Elias Troyer, had led our community for nearly 20 years by the time I was a teenager. He was not a large man, but he had a particular way of entering a room. Slow, deliberate, as though he had decided in advance that nothing inside it could surprise him. The members of our district respected him the way you respect a stone wall. You don't question whether it belongs there. You simply walk around it. My father died when I was 14, and after that my mother managed the household with a kind of compressed efficiency that left very little room for softness. She was not unkind. She fed us. She kept us clothed. She made sure we were in our seats every Sunday. But she had learned, somewhere in the years of raising 6 children mostly alone, that the safest thing a woman in our community could do was to draw as little attention to her family as possible. Problems were handled quietly, or they were not handled at all. I was engaged by the time I was 18 to a young man named Daniel Byler, whose family had farmed 3 miles north of ours for 2 generations. Daniel was steady and capable and not unkind, and I want to be fair to him here because I think fairness matters more than anger, even now. He did not understand what was happening to me any more than I did, or at least, that is what I told myself for a long time. We were to be married the following November, and the summer before our wedding was the summer of those 3 Sundays. The first collapse happened on the 2nd Sunday of August. I told you how my mother responded. What I have not yet told you is what Daniel did. He was seated across the room from me. Men and women sat separately in our meeting house, and by the time I was upright again, being steered to a bench near the back wall, he had not moved from his place. I looked for him across the room. He was watching me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not worry, something more careful than worry. Something that looked, from that distance, almost like calculation. I told myself I was misreading him. I told myself the light was wrong. My mother kept her hand on my arm the entire walk home, and said very little. That evening at supper, she mentioned that I should probably eat more in the mornings before meeting. She said it the way she said most things. Once, plainly, without elaboration, and then she moved on to discussing whether the garden needed more staking before the rains came. I waited to see if she would say something else. She didn't. No one suggested a doctor. In our district, medical care was not forbidden, but it was treated as something you sought only when the situation was genuinely serious. And fainting once in church in the summer heat was not, by our community's measure, genuinely serious. I understood that. I accepted it. I drank more water the following week, and went to bed earlier, and told myself that the strange, hollow feeling I carried around my ribcage was probably just nerves about the wedding. The 2nd Sunday was the 14th of August. I know the date because I wrote it in the small notebook I kept beneath my mattress. Not a diary exactly, more a list of things I noticed and didn't understand yet. I had started keeping it after my father died, when I realized that some things needed to be written down, or they simply dissolved. That second Sunday, I had eaten a full breakfast. I had drunk 2 glasses of water. I had opened the bedroom window for an hour before we left. I fainted anyway, approximately 40 minutes into the meeting, and this time I did not simply sink. I went down hard, and I struck my shoulder against the edge of the bench on my way to the floor, and I woke up with several women crouched around me, and a ringing in my ears that lasted most of the afternoon. This time, Daniel did cross the room. He stood at the edge of the small circle of women and looked down at me, and one of the older women, Hannah Stoltzfus, who had been a midwife for 30 years, looked up at him and said, "She needs to see someone, Daniel." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at my mother, who was already rearranging my cap again. "She's been anxious about the wedding," my mother said. "It's a difficult time." Hannah Stoltzfus held her position for a moment longer. She was a broad-shouldered woman with a direct gaze and very little patience for conclusions that arrived too quickly. She pressed 2 fingers gently to the inside of my wrist and said nothing for a count of several seconds. Then she sat back on her heels and said, "Her pulse is irregular." My mother said, "All right, Hannah," in a tone that very politely closed the door. I watched Daniel look at my mother. I watched something pass between them, not words, not even exactly a glance, but a kind of mutual arrival at a position. And then Daniel said that he would drive me home early, and Hannah Stoltzfus stood up slowly and said nothing more, and that was the end of it. In the wagon on the way home, I asked Daniel if we could speak to a doctor before the wedding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother doesn't think it's necessary." I said, "Hannah Stoltzfus does." He said, "Hannah Stoltzfus isn't marrying you." He said it without cruelty. That was the thing I kept turning over in the days that followed. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. And I thought about the expression I had seen on his face across the meeting house after the first collapse. And I thought about the way he had looked at my mother before he spoke. And I began to wonder, for the first time, whether the two of them had already discussed this. Not the fainting specifically, but the general principle of what to do about me. The week between the second and third Sunday was the longest week of that summer. I felt unwell in a way I could not precisely name. Not sick exactly. More like something inside me was running at the wrong speed. I was tired in the mornings and restless at night, and there were afternoons when my heart seemed to stumble over itself for a few seconds, before settling again. I wrote all of this in my notebook. I wrote it in small, careful handwriting, as though keeping the observations neat might help me understand them. I went to my mother on Wednesday evening, after the younger children were in bed. I told her, as plainly as I could, that something was wrong with me. Not wedding nerves. Something physical. I told her about the stumbling heartbeat. I told her I was frightened. She listened to all of it. She was mending a shirt at the table, and she did not put the shirt down while I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sarah, you have always been sensitive. You felt things more than your brothers and sisters. That is not a fault, but it is something you need to manage." I said, "Mama, I think there is something wrong with my heart." She said, "There is nothing wrong with your heart that prayer and a settled mind won't improve." She folded the shirt, placed it on the pile, and told me to go to bed. I lay awake for a long time that night, and something shifted in me during those hours. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a door shifts in a frame during the first frost of the year. I began to understand that my mother was not going to help me, not because she didn't love me. I believe she did love me, in the contained and frightened way she loved everything, but because helping me would have required her to draw attention to our family, to challenge a narrative that was already forming around the word that kept appearing in quiet conversations I was not supposed to hear, the word nerves. And because helping me would have required her to admit that something was wrong in a household she had spent years presenting as adequately managed. My silence was part of how she maintained that presentation. I had just never understood that before. The third Sunday was the 21st of August. I considered not going. I lay in bed that morning, and I thought about the stumbling heartbeat and the ringing ears, and the way the floor of the meeting house had felt against my cheek, and I thought, I could say I am ill. I could simply say it and stay here. But I also knew what that would cost. A young woman who did not attend Sunday meeting 2 weeks before her engagement was formally announced would be noticed. Questions would be asked. And the questions would find their way to Bishop Troyer, who was already aware of the previous 2 Sundays. And I did not yet know what he would do with that awareness. But I understood instinctively that I had more control over the situation if I was present than if I was absent. That is the logic of a person who has been taught that visibility is dangerous, but invisibility is worse. I know that now. At 19, I only knew that I was afraid to stay home. I sat through the first hour of meeting, with my hands folded in my lap, and my eyes fixed forward, and my jaw set. I breathed slowly. I counted the boards in the ceiling. I did the calculations I had taught myself. Focus on something fixed, something at eye level. Do not lock your knees. Breathe from the low part of your lungs. I almost made it. Approximately 75 minutes in, the room tilted. I had just enough awareness to reach for the arm of the woman beside me, a girl I had grown up with, Miriam Esch. And then I was on the floor again, and the meeting house ceiling was above me, and there was a sound like rushing water in both ears. When the sound faded, the first voice I heard clearly was Bishop Troyer's. He had not come to help me. He was standing several feet back, at the edge of the circle, and he was speaking to the congregation, not to me, not about me medically, but about me as a subject. His voice was measured and not unkind in its surface tone, which somehow made it worse. He said that some among us, in moments of spiritual testing, sought relief through outward expression. He said that the body sometimes produced symptoms that were, in truth, the spirit asking for attention it should be seeking through prayer. He said this gently. He said it as a general observation. But every person in that room understood who he was talking about. And I lay on that floor and listened to my community rearrange its understanding of me in real time. And I felt something leave me that I have never entirely recovered. My mother did not correct him. She adjusted my cap. Daniel, I was told later, nodded once. It was Miriam Esch who helped me to the back bench. It was Miriam who brought me water and held the cup while my hands shook too much to hold it myself. And it was Miriam, 2 days later, who walked 3 miles to my family's farm and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, very quietly, "My aunt in Lancaster saw a heart doctor last spring. I can write down his name if you want it." I looked at her for a long moment. She said, "You are not seeking attention, Sarah. You never have been." I understood, in that moment, the full cost of what the bishop had said. He had not simply embarrassed me. He had constructed a story that would follow me into my marriage, into my children's lives, into every future moment of physical vulnerability. He had built a framework inside which any future symptom I reported could be dismissed as performance. And he had done it in front of every person whose opinion would shape my life for the next several decades. What I did not yet understand was why. I took Miriam's piece of paper. I folded it and placed it inside my notebook, underneath everything else. And I began, for the first time, to ask questions I had not thought to ask before. The answer took me several weeks to find, and it came not from my mother, not from Daniel, but from Hannah Stoltzfus, who appeared at our back door one September afternoon, with a jar of preserves she had not been asked to bring, and a look on her face that told me the preserves were not the point. She sat down at my kitchen table, and she told me, in her direct and unhurried way, that she had known my mother for 30 years. She told me that when I was a small child, too small to remember, I had been seen by a doctor in a neighboring town who had noted something about my heart rhythm, a small irregularity. Nothing immediately dangerous, the doctor had said, but something to monitor. Something that could cause episodes under stress, in heat, when the body was pushed without adequate fuel or rest. My mother had known. She had known since I was 4 years old. She had told no one in our district, because in our district at that time, a girl with any history of medical irregularity was considered, in certain conversations that happened quietly and with closed doors, a risk. A risk in terms of childbearing. A risk in terms of the physical labor of community life. A risk that a prospective husband's family might weigh carefully before committing. My mother had kept silent to protect my marriageability. Daniel's family had been told something, not the full truth, Hannah believed, but enough to understand that the fainting should be minimized, not investigated. Enough to understand that if a doctor looked closely, the engagement might become complicated. And Bishop Troyer, who had been a close friend of Daniel's father for 30 years, had provided the narrative that sealed everything in place. Not because he was malicious, because a clean story was easier for everyone than a medical one. Because a girl seeking attention could be corrected. A girl with a heart condition required accommodation. Accommodation was not something our district extended easily. I sat with all of this for a long time. I sat with the image of my mother, holding that information for 15 years, carrying it carefully, using it to manage her household's presentation in the community, while her daughter fell to the floor of the meeting house 3 times and was publicly called theatrical. I sat with Daniel's measured expression across the room, his quiet consultation with my mother in the wagon, his calm dismissal of Hannah Stoltzfus's concern. I sat with Bishop Troyer's voice, even and pastoral, rearranging the truth in front of 100 people. And then I took Miriam's piece of paper out of my notebook, and I made an appointment in Lancaster, and I went alone. The doctor I saw was a quiet man with a methodical manner, and he spent a great deal of time listening to my chest with his eyes closed. He asked me a careful list of questions. He ordered a test that required me to return the following week. When I came back, he sat across a desk from me and explained, in plain language, what my heart had been doing since I was 4 years old, and possibly longer. He used terms I wrote down in my notebook and looked up afterward. He said it was manageable. He said I should not stand for extended periods in extreme heat without eating. He said there were things that could help. He said, "Did you know about this before today?" I said, "I found out recently." He looked at me for a moment and said nothing more on the subject. I drove the wagon home, and I sat in the yard until the light was nearly gone, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not an act of rebellion exactly, more like a quiet arrival at a boundary I had not known I possessed until I felt it beneath my feet. I told my mother what the doctor had said. She went very still. I told her what Hannah Stoltzfus had told me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I did what I thought was best for you." I said, "I know." I said it without anger, because by that point the anger had settled into something more durable, a clear-eyed understanding of the machinery I had been living inside. My mother had been frightened. Daniel's family had been protecting an investment. The bishop had been protecting an alliance and a narrative. None of them had sat on that floor. None of them had heard the rushing water in their ears. I did not marry Daniel Byler. The engagement ended quietly, the way most things ended in our district, without a public explanation, without an announcement, with a gradual withdrawal that people interpreted according to their own assumptions. My mother was devastated in a way she expressed through silence and extra work. Daniel, I was told, married a girl from a district north of ours the following spring. I left the community 2 years later, not in a single dramatic departure, but in the incremental way of someone who has finally stopped pretending that the wall belongs there. I took my notebook. I took the doctor's paperwork. I took the piece of paper Miriam Esch had walked 3 miles to give me, because I wanted to remember that in a room full of people who chose the easier story, there had been one person who did not. I have managed my heart condition for 30 years now, with medication, and with the simple knowledge of what my body needs. It has not prevented me from working, from building a life, from raising 2 children who know, because I told them early, that the body is worth listening to, even when the people around you find the listening inconvenient. Bishop Troyer died more than a decade ago. I did not attend the service. I have thought about him less than you might expect, not because what he said didn't matter, but because I eventually understood that he was not the center of the story. He was the last layer, the outermost one. The center was my mother's silence. The center was a 4-year-old's medical record folded and placed somewhere private and never retrieved. The center was every morning she handed me a glass of water and said to pray through it, knowing there was more she could have given me. I don't believe she was a bad person. I believe she was a woman who had learned that her children's safety depended on their being uncomplicated, and that she made a choice, over and over again, for 15 years, to protect what she thought was my future at the expense of my present. I understand it. I do not excuse it. Those two things live in me at the same time, and I have stopped waiting for one of them to defeat the other. Miriam Esh still writes to me twice a year. We are not close in the way we might have been, but there is something in those letters that I value more than closeness. A plain, steady acknowledgement that she saw what she saw, and she chose not to look away. That is rarer than it sounds. My cap is long gone. I don't miss it particularly. But sometimes, when the light comes through a window at a certain angle on a Sunday morning, I think about the ceiling of that meeting house, and the sound of rushing water, and a bishop's careful voice rewriting a story while I lay on the floor. And I think about a girl smoothing a piece of fabric that didn't need smoothing, trying to keep everything in its proper place, understanding even then, even at 19, even half-conscious on a wooden floor, that the placing of the cap was not for her. It never was.